You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG. Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries, a podcast about Shadowdark and other role-playing games, where two GMs talk about their recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful that you can take to yours. On the show today, we meet the Maker. Hello there, sages and adventurers. My name is Matt, and with me, as always, is my good friend and GM colleague, Jody.
Hey, what's up? But that's enough for me.
All right. Let's dive right in, Jody. Today on the show, we are going to do something a bit different. While we usually like to discuss something that happened at our table in a recent session, we thought it might be fun to kind of change things up. So today, we have the distinct honor and pleasure of interviewing a woman who probably got all her steps in from last year, just walking back and forth from the podium to her seat at the Ennies, and whose writing is the TTRPG equivalent of a Hemingway novel, both terse and moving. Growing up, she cut her teeth playing games with some of Wisconsin's TTRPG OGs and took those sensibilities first to adventure writing for 5th edition and then on to writing Shadowdark RPG. Her writing prowess is only challenged by her business savvy. Shadowdark's inclusion of a generous third-party license has led to an ever-growing community of third-party creators, furthering and encouraging the DIY spirit from which the TTRPG genre began. And now she's on the verge of another Kickstarter, which will see the release of 3 new Cursed Scrolls. And if you haven't already, what are you doing? Go and sign up using the link in the show notes to make sure you know when the Kickstarter goes live. Do it now. Pause the podcast. So without further ado, let's gather around the fire and welcome the Queen of the Core 4, the Destroyer of Hammers, and the person who made fighters actually fun to play. Kelsey, how are you?
Hi, what an intro. That was the most glorious thing I've ever heard. Thank you.
Destroyer of Hammers. There it is.
That's a deep cut.
I had to get that in there.
Worthy of Crom.
Yes. Oh, how are you all?
Doing well. Thank you so much for being here. Can't wait to learn a little bit about you and about this upcoming Kickstarter, which everyone is so anxiously awaiting.
Ooh, me too.
But we're going to end there. We're not going to start there. No. It's tease the good stuff. You got to hang out, listeners, and endure our yammerings in between Kelsey's interesting talking points. So kind of the show is going to go a little bit about you and your background, hopefully a little bit deeper dive, stuff you haven't maybe shared in a million other spots and a million other views, the price of success following you around and all that. And then we'll talk a little bit about Shadowdark specific. We'll try and keep away from too crunchy, how does this work kind of questions, and more conceptual. And then, of course, we will end in talking a little bit about those Cursed Scrolls that are coming forward and what people can get out of those. So, Matt, why don't you dive in on the first question?
All right, so Kelsey, you've spoken a lot about your history as a gamer in other places, and you were lucky enough to roll dice with the legends. But you haven't always been a TTRPG designer. You were a teacher, a journalist, you worked in tech. How has that kind of varied career experience influenced both Shadowdark and your game mastering?
Oh, yeah. I feel like I took something from each one of those jobs and roles that I did that ended up helping me out in what I do now. And I think first and foremost, it kept me staying a learner because I switched careers so drastically several times that I really started over from the ground up. And I think that adopting a mentality of learning how to do things that are crucial to your own personal success is really a good thing to do. And it helped me, pick up the skills that I needed to make Shadowdark. Like, I think people were astonished by this, but Shadowdark is the first time that I really used InDesign to do layout. I almost hesitate to say that even because people were like, but it won an Ennie for layout and design. And I'm like, well, I learned from who I could find as the best sources. So having worked in teaching and tech and journalism, I think that it gave me this mentality of always trying to build new skills. And it certainly helped with writing, with conveying information, which is something teachers must do, as you guys know. And,
Yep.
even in tech, like running my own company and all of the online sales and tech and all of the setup required for that. I mean, it really helped me being fluent in the internet stuff that I needed to know to do all of those things. So I really think it came full circle.
I've been dying to ask because I don't know that I saw it anywhere. What grade level span was your brief time with the youngins?
Yes, I had the strangest experience with this. So I went from being like a language translation assistant in a United States-based K-12, like a grade school. This was like one of my first jobs out of college because my degree was in journalism. And the month I graduated was like the month the recession hit, and the biggest paper in Wisconsin, in the city I lived in, fired 200 reporters the month I graduated. So I was like, well, this doesn't look good. So I moved back to my hometown, and I was working as a language translator from Spanish to English at the grade school that I attended as a child. And then I was also a beat reporter for the local newspaper in that same town. So I was at first doing grade school assistance, and then a couple years went by, and I actually accepted a grant program to go teach English as a second language in Spain. And so I was teaching all grade levels in Spain from pre-K up through high school. So it was pretty interesting.
Wow. Yeah. Now that also adds another layer to the language skills and like the minimalist design kind of Shadow Dark and the conveying of information, as you said. One of Matt's first kind of bold proclamations when we started role playing together was, man, jamming is like teaching. And I went, no, it's not. Yeah, actually it is. And it's amazing how many crossover skills are in there. I don't know if that's been your experience or not, but like it's weird how often it'll be like, I'm not sure what to do with this table situation. And you can just go, well, if I were teaching right now, I would, and an answer presents itself.
Yeah, Jody, it's so interesting that I actually found that having been a dungeon master previous to getting the certifications I needed to teach helped me so much. Like one of the things that really helped me do was get up in front of a crowd of people and sort of guide activities in an organized fashion. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm almost going into dungeon master mode when I'm doing this. I felt a connection to the process of DMing that I was really surprised to find. And it helped me so much. It really did. I felt bad for students that got thrown into teaching in front of a classroom and didn't have that experience.
Yeah, that's it. I hadn't even considered that part of it. I'm going to stand and deliver, and I'm going to be the goofiest person in the room, and I'm going to like own the space for a minute of like, yeah, that's teaching, and there it is. All right, we're going to take you back a little bit. Some of your earliest internet days on YouTube. You had a video pretty early on that was my minimalist dungeon master kit, and you then went and revised that. However, you described yourself as a minimalist, not just as a GM, but kind of as a life philosophy and life skill. Are you still? And if so, what benefits of that philosophy do you experience in life? And then how do you balance that in a hobby that is really good at getting you to buy and have things? As a mini war gamer, I gave up. I quit. No, their minimalism can be my lifestyle away from the hobby, but in the hobby, I'm like, more miniatures is better. How do you approach that just on your day-to-day? And then also as just navigating this hobby space where there's a lot of cool toys?
Oh, I know, because this hobby it's about the stuff, kind of. You need the stuff to play the hobby, and I mean, to a certain extent. And so I definitely do consider myself a minimalist still. But it's kind of a thing where you might consider yourself an athlete, but you're not always actively playing the sport at the highest level, you know? So
I feel very seen.
Yes. And I'm not in my hardcore minimalist phase, but I still try to practice the idea of getting value out of something doesn't mean that you must always keep it in order to have that value. And as you guys probably have experienced, you know, you get a lot of books. I'm lucky enough to get sent things by people sometimes, like people who've made something for Shadow Dark send me a copy of it, and it's so cool. And I'm like accumulating stuff. And every so often what I have to do is really just look through what I have and be like, am I really using this? Have I referenced it? Have I read it and gotten what I wanted out of it? And now is it time for me to give it to someone who can get the same thing out of it that I did? So, you know, there's a pending trip to the local library where I'm going to take some books that have given me what they can. And now it's almost like not right for me to keep them because I'm not going to get anything else out of them. I think that mentality also just extends into sort of a lifestyle and a practice at large. Like how I write is coming from a place of minimalism. Even how I dress is coming from a place of minimalism. I'm pretty simple. I'm always in like a black t-shirt, just being myself. So, I find that it keeps me kind of grounded and kind of focused on what matters and constantly trying to remind myself what matters when I am not always clearly seeing that.
So I have kind of a follow-up to that actually is a nice segue into kind of the next question that we had, which is, so when you're looking at your books or the stuff that you kind of come back to every now and again to figure out what you're going to keep for the hobby, is there anything in particular that is particularly noteworthy that maybe is interesting or sort of eccentric that you keep around because it's important to you that maybe other folks might not have in their collection? Maybe it's a book that has some value. Is there anything in particular you can think of that you keep around that other folks might not have in their collection?
Oh, that's such a great question. I'm sure. So I do have like a weird mishmash of old school D&D books. Like so for instance, I played a lot of 3rd edition D&D when it came out, which was like the early 2000s. And I actually no longer have the Player's Handbook and Monster Manual that I started with. I have just the DM's Guide from my 3rd edition original set because it was signed by Gary Gygax. He signed the book to me. And so I ended up like parting with the other 2 and keeping just the one book. And I think that's kind of weird. I don't know if a lot of people will keep like the one core book. They usually want like all 3 or none. And so I have this weird scattering of like singular core books that are an incomplete set because they had some special meaning to me.
I mean, that's, if you're going to keep something, that seems like a pretty reasonable thing to keep around in the collection. And on that note, Shadow Dark has a pretty specific tone, and you have a long history kind of in the hobby. But are there? This question is ostensibly about an Appendix N. You weren't going to get out of here without an Appendix N question. So are there any references that are kind of cornerstones for your home games, kind of campaign world, or things that kind of closely reflect what is presented in Shadow Dark or in the Cursed Scrolls, where there's allusions and kind of nods to a larger setting, and we're just kind of getting this nice little drip, drip, drip of your vision for a fantasy world?
Oh yeah, what a great question. It's funny because, well, first of all, speaking to the fantasy world of Shadow Dark, it's definitely inspired by my own set of reading, like especially when I was younger, and it's so interesting. I'm like the slight side diversion from this main point is that I have found that to me the most inspiring material always comes back to fiction, like prose fiction. Like I've tried a lot to like read adventures, like these amazing adventures written by amazing adventure writers. And when I read them, I'm seeking like inspiration or like some cool little thing that I could turn into my own idea. But I actually find that doesn't work so well for me. So what I get the most kind of like cauldron of soupy ideas from is reading fiction. And I now understand much more why the creators of the game cited an Appendix N and really viewed it as their most probably influential source and sources. And so I have my own set of books that were maybe like the fantasy books of my youth. Probably my favorite book is Sabriel by Garth Nix. And it's a book about a young woman who is like a necromancer, but she's the one good necromancer whose job is to defeat the evil ones and keep the dead down. But to do this, she needs to engage with the dead and also walk in the land of death and all of that. And the spellcasting system in there is centered around something called the Charter, which is like a sort of God and man-made agreed to system of law-like magic. There are laws, there are runes that describe specific elements of spells. And that is represented very distantly, but as a reference in Shadow Dark, where there's a god called Madeira the Covenant, who is like the god of law, and the laws of reality are a series of symbols. And so, I'm pulling from the fiction I read as a kid, and it's quite different from how it was represented in that fiction, but now how it's impacted me and how it's bled into my own creativity there is a link, So, did I lose the thread of the rest of the question? I definitely do have an Appendix N. Those kinds of books. Classic Sword and Sorcery, too. it's hard not to have that be inspiring, like the Conan the Barbarian stories. For all of their facets, ultimately really do have a lot of sword and sorcery inspiration in them. And they definitely influenced early dungeon design. You can see that. So I do love sword and sorcery style fiction as well. Mm-hmm.
That's a perfect transition to our next question, because we're going to go a little bit more role-playing community and away from that fictional, but there's an undeniable parallel here. So you are steeped in the OSR. Your forthcoming, is it at Gen Con talk about the state of the OSR is coming up. So now the OSR is kind of this weird dichotomy of, it is on one hand a place of incredible creativity and innovation, especially, you know, in its earliest founding days and even still today in terms of freedom of design and new ideas. But there's also a portion of it that is just really stodgy and dogmatic about what is the OSR and thou shalt. So in your interview with Dave Thomavor quite a while back, you described Shadow Dark is originally coming from a place where you wanted a system that would let you write and run the kind of exploration-focused modern OSR adventures you wanted to see. Can you share what you mean by the phrase modern OSR? What is modern OSR?
Yeah. Oh, this is an interesting thing where I feel like, to me, the OSR is a little bit more of a feeling than it is a rule set. It's like a style of play that comes forth as a result of the rules in place. And so when we're talking about like modernizing the rules, I was kind of referring to taking game design innovations that have facilitated or made easier the process of playing the game while still trying to retain the feeling that those old systems were working to invoke. And so, you know, it's funny because I feel like there are a lot of people who want to play old school games who bounce off of rule systems that are a little bit more arcane and archaic, perhaps, you know, where there's, you know, different dice rolls needed to accomplish different types of skills, or high versus low rolling is blended. And so what I was trying to do was I guess modernize or unify and add some recent game design polish to rule sets that were still trying to accomplish the same thing. So that's where I come from when I say it's modern.
It's a vibe.
Yeah.
This is such music to my ears, because I feel like, Jody, you've heard me, you know, for years being somewhat frustrated by the fact that I really wanted to run for a long time a BX, you know, OSE game. But I was just so frustrated by the fact that I felt like, even if it wasn't true, I felt like I was asking the players to learn some mechanics that were counterintuitive, especially coming from 5th edition. And I say that because I think it's a nice setup to kind of a follow-up here that, you know, when we start talking about modernizing the game mechanics, there definitely are people who, you know, I maybe overgeneralize here, but are like, BX is a perfect system. You just never play anything else, or, you know, AD&D or Osric or whatever it is. And I don't mean to be pejorative, but like that's sometimes how it feels. And so some of you can get into the situation where there feels like there's a campification, where we're starting to kind of actually see the people who are sticking with those old school kind of, you know, retro clone rule sets, and then folks who are gravitating, like we are, to these more modernized mechanics and games like Shadow Dark. And I just wonder how you feel about I don't want to use the word fracturing because that feels too negative, but this is something that I worry about, is when communities start to drift apart and like campify, and there can be some animosity. And I don't know if you have any thoughts. This is a very open-ended question, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, and the fact that Shadow Dark is, for better and for worse, a part of that genesis of the OSR in the current kind of situation that we're in.
Yeah, and Matt, I sometimes call it kind of like the branching, because it does feel like things are moving away from each other. And, you know, we're getting really clear distinctions between different kinds of old school games, where people can't even agree whether games are old school anymore, because there's a disagreement between whether it's the mentality or feel, or whether it's the actual rule system, or, you know, whether it's the lineage of the game, you know, how far is it removed from an actual like core D&D game. And so I think that I can't fault people for wanting to categorize, because it's one thing that we as nerds love to do. We love to define and categorize. Oh, yeah. But I do think that what's going to have to happen is either the term OSR is going to have to become a more broadly accepted umbrella term, or we're going to have to come up with new sort of styles and camps that we really acknowledge are unique and different enough from each other. So I think, because there's this current argument about like, does the OSR encompass all of this stuff? And if not, then what is it? And I don't know if I personally see tons of distinctions between, I see two major distinctions. I see retro clones, which are very directly linked to an original rule set, making only minor changes. So technically kind of a hack of that system. And then I see ground up different systems that are trying to stay in the lineage of Dungeons and Dragons, but completely reimagine all of the interlocking systems. And I think Shadowdark falls more into the latter camp for sure. In fact, I think it very, very squarely falls into the new interlocking systems that is a lineage of D&D, but is not a hack / retro clone. And to me, those are the two major camps. That's really it.
So I'm going to spin this in a positive for a moment. Taking old school, the OSR, and new school, whatever that is, because it's just as fraught in what the heck is new school. And I got my own definition, but that's not what people are tuning in for. So for you, what is the best part about old school gaming, and what's the best thing about new school gaming? Like, if we're going to look at those as two distinct differences, which is debatable in and of itself as a premise, what's the one thing you would go, you know what? I like this from this one, and I definitely like this from this one, and let's celebrate those.
Oh, yeah. I love that, because I think these two things I could very clearly state, and I think they're both the core thesis of Shadowdark. So from old school gaming, the thing I like most is the sort of tactical infinity, open resolution, unlimited exploration focus of the game, where you're almost a real person with real options, and you don't feel limited by what's given to you to do. Those things are just tools to help inspire your creativity. I feel as time went on, that was lost in the systems of D&D or tamped down. Conversely, in the more modern side of things, I think that its greatest strength is unified and intuitive resolution. So ever since the D20 era and forward, I feel like we've been making greater improvements in the D&D lineage, at least, toward a really easy to understand resolution system that's so powerful that it's people almost can't imagine Dungeons and Dragons without D20 roll high now. If you were to ask someone who started playing from the last 15 years, but it wasn't always that way, So when you take these two really powerful things, I wanted to take both of those and combine them in Shadowdark. And I think they're both the greatest strength of each style.
I agree, and that's why it's my home system. So there you go. I told Matt early on when we both first became aware of Shadowdark, I was like, after I read through it, this is the game my buddies and I, when we were like 11 and 12, were playing anyway, even though we were playing D&D, but didn't understand all the little quirky twists of the system. Shadowdark is really close to what we ended up doing, just improved through a lens of thoughtful iteration. But it was that intuitive piece plays out to be so true. We're going to stick with the OSR a little bit longer and ask a couple more questions here. This one, on a little bit of a personal level, comes to some degree from my wife and daughter. My wife is a gamer. Loosely, gaming is how we met. Our daughter is then, unsurprisingly, also a gamer, but also just graduated college with a writing degree. And I understandably was like, hey, I get to talk to Kelsey. Thoughts? And one of the things my daughter really brought to me was just kind of an interesting quirk of the OSR, and she was curious of your personal experience as it relates to the following. So the OSR has kind of historically been dominated by white, hetero, cis dudes. That's generally been the demographic we've seen. Now, in the last few years, that definitely has started to change, and we're seeing a much more diverse group of folks. Can you share some of your own experiences and perspectives as they relate to the expanding demographics of the OSR and just kind of the RPG community in general?
Yeah. Well, first of all, congrats to your daughter for graduating and with such a cool degree, creative writing. That is so cool. And yes,
agree.
I know, that's wonderful. And well, so I agree that it's true that, the first people who played and created D&D was a small group of friends in the Midwest. It was guys who were into wargaming. So, understandably, it was a very limited scope of people because the people they invited into play were the people they knew who might be interested. And so the game was created by that group, and it was what it was. And I think I came into gaming in the 90s, and so things were starting to open up. The internet was starting to bloom, and I think that a lot of hobbies were becoming more visible and more accessible to people. And D&D had been a big cultural revolution about around the time I was born, honestly. And so it had worked its way into like the pop culture mindset a little bit more. And I think it was at that point that it kind of hit the ground running with groups of people playing it that might never have otherwise come across it. And I was certainly one of them. I was the only girl that was playing in my gaming group as a kid. However, I think it's really neat to note that the gaming store that I played at was co-owned by a husband and wife team. And it always made me really happy to see Hope is her name when I went in, and to see her there. And she was just as much into gaming and Magic the Gathering and all that. So I thought that was really cool. And I was like, wow, I hope I can grow up to be as cool as Hope someday. But despite me being the only girl in the room, and even times I met Gary Gygax in person, and everybody was so deeply welcoming, including Gary. I think there have been people talking about ways he may or may not have treated other people, but I've met him in real life, and he was extremely encouraging to me. And he was so excited for me that I wanted to be a dungeon master. He asked me, he was like, I heard you want to be a dungeon master, because the reason I got to meet him was because my dungeon master played in his weekly game, and he called in a favor so that I could meet Gary on my birthday, which was wild. And he was so encouraging, and he signed my book, and he told me I should become a dungeon master and that I should have no mercy on my players. And he treated me just the way he would have, treated anybody else. And he was also so great with young people. Like, honestly, he kind of had that like conspiratorial grandpa vibe who like kind of like throws slightly edgy jokes to make you feel like you're part of like the grown-up crowd. Like nothing crazy, but like slightly edgy stuff. And he was just so welcoming. So I never once felt unwelcome anywhere that I was. And, perhaps that's a unique to me situation. I'm sure not everybody has felt that way, no matter who they are. But everybody around me was so excited about gaming and so excited that I loved it, that I think that at the end of the day, the passion was just what united us. And then, as the years went on, more women and more people kind of got a taste of that, and I think also felt pretty welcomed. And we're now seeing that play out where a huge amount of the player base for D&D is women. And, possibly an unthinkable amount if you were to look 15, 20 years ago. So, as this trajectory continues, I think that passion and welcoming behavior wins out by and large over anything else. And we've seen just the great results of that.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of bi-weekly game that I run for our teacher group is half women. And I think both you and I, Jody, have found that the hobby has exploded, and with more people comes, first of all, just more gaming opportunities. It's better for designers and people who are designing games who can reach more people. And it's really heartening to see the hobby moving in this direction. And certainly it's also very heartening to hear that you had such a wonderful experience. Also, that I love this idea of Gary telling you to not to not have any mercy on your players. And I'm going to use that to this is kind of a hard pivot away from an earnest question about your history in the hobby to something that's a bit of a hobby horse for me. And so Jody and I were like writing these questions, and inevitably I was going to ask this one. So
yep, this is a thing I haven't had an answer for yet. So hopefully, Kelsey, you can
so
put it to bed.
Using that kind of that hook of Gary telling you to not go easy on your players, I wanted to ask you about permission structures and like getting permission from the visionaries and the luminaries, and so within any RPG community, there are people who really insist and enjoy trying to cleave as closely to rules as written as possible, right? And then there are those, and I will say that Jody and I are the filthy home brewers. We're the hackers. We look at a system and we immediately start thinking how we're going to change it. So there are folks like us, and there are folks who are more rules as written. And I just wanted to kind of get a sense of what is your reaction to people who are who are resistant to the idea of hacking Shadow Dark and, either come to the Discord or Facebook or other community spaces, trying to cling pretty tightly to playing the game rules as written when there's a pretty clear ethos, especially in the one rule and some of the other sections of the book that really give they create a permission structure for making rulings and doing things your way. You clearly have that spirit and have taken it kind of to its zenith, I would say. But what is your response to that desire to really cleave as close to the rules as possible?
Yeah, I think that there are definitely two distinct types of gamer, and I think that us three are probably in the camp of like, yes, hack it. I mean, as someone who wrote a game, I have to be. I have to be. So everything is boils down to that at the end of the day. And I always encourage people to treat Shadow Dark that way, since that's how it was built. It was built on the notion of mixing and matching and hacking and coming up with unique things that didn't really try to hold on to sacred cows. And so, yeah, I put specific kind of design help in the core ethos of the game because I knew and I wanted people to hack it. And I wanted to be like, well, coming from my perspective, because I built all these underlying systems and know deeply how they engage with each other. Here's how to not fall off the cliff, designing. Here's how to not accidentally break something integral to the game, unless you want to. But now that you're aware of it, now you can decide instead of accidentally falling off the cliff. And so that's the side that I most align with. But I understand the other camp, which is that, we want rules because it gives us a sense of security in how things are supposed to play out. And almost, I think sometimes, almost protects people from feeling like things are getting out of control in their game. Because especially as new game masters, I'm sure, as when all of us were first starting to run our games, I think we were most worried about something happening that we hadn't planned for, and so I think that's true with people who really cling to the rules, or I shouldn't say cling, but cleave to the rules, because I think they want to make sure that stuff doesn't happen that's outside of like the intended experience. So I don't fault them for that. And that's why we codify rules in the first place, is to give them something to hang their hats on. But I will say to them that it's unlikely you're going to really terribly break anything. So if it turns out that you have to change a rule or you accidentally misimplement a rule, it'll probably be okay. So give it a try. It might be fun.
Just one attack per turn. One attack per turn.
Just please. Yeah. Even I break that rule. Every rule I've made, I have broken in my own design.
So let me ask you real quick a follow-up on this one. In your very early days, you touched on it a little bit of James Mishler was the gentleman who played with Gary in his weekly group and then kind of introduced you. I'm curious, in those early days, a lot of GMs have the experience, and gamers in general, of initially follow the rules because you're just starting out and that's what you know. And then eventually you kind of start meeting people and hanging out, or you're just wired this way to like start hacking rules. Do you recall if Mr. Mishler was freewheeling and designing then, and were you initially like the hobby you were first shown was just make it up as you go, or did you kind of have an evolution from, no, I follow the rules really tightly and now I do what I want? What was those kind of elements? How did those fit together?
What's so funny, Jody, is James gave us the impression that he was a rule stickler, but he wasn't actually. And I came to realize this as I aged. And I was a kid when I was first playing in his games. And then as an adult, I had gone back, we played a game together at GaryCon. I play in games with him somewhat regularly still. And I've noticed when he's running games that he will use the rules as a way to keep people focused and on task. But he's the first person to secretly bend something when it would suit the moment. He's got very excellent narrative instinct and dramatic instinct in what he runs. And I remember, for example, this is a great example. I remember when I was a kid, we were in a dungeon, of course, and we were running down a hallway trying to escape some orcs that had attacked us, and we couldn't escape. We couldn't find a way out of the dungeon. So we decided we had to rest in the dungeon, which everybody knows is a terrible idea, but he let us make our own mistakes. He didn't warn us. He was like, that's, all right, you're going to try to find a room and rest in the dungeon. And I actually came up with an idea for how to make this weird barricade around the door that would alert us if anything tried to get through. I like precariously stacked a bunch of pots that were in this room in this strange way. And this wasn't in the rules, this wasn't in the rules. But he really like respected that attempt at like playing smart, and he ended up making it matter. He made it matter. And so of course there was no rule that said like, roll a skill check to stack pots and then like the orcs have to roll a check to sneak around the pots. He just made it work. And he gave me an experience points bonus for like thinking up a good idea, which I was very grateful for. So he was subtle, but really good at making the rules come into play when it mattered and then ignoring them when it didn't.
I love that. No pot stacking rules, but yeah, no, heard and felt 100%.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, speaking of subtlety, let's talk about Shadowdark's layout and design, which is both subtle in its simplicity. I think like you don't notice the design until you do, I think is kind of the brilliance of it. So this was intentional. You've said numerous times in interviews that the design of Shadowdark was extremely intentional, and probably, we have tried to model our little zines that we make for our groups on your design, and we have found that it is limiting in ways that are quite challenging. And so you have said that you spent a lot of time and energy trying to get the layout just right, and I'm assuming that also means that you had to get the words just right and the word counts and all of that unseen work that goes into creating a book that delivers information clearly, as we talked about before. One of the outcomes of that design is that folks like Jody and I, it gave us a chance to make zines and supplements, and they look and feel like the real thing because your design was both simplistic, clean, and effective. But like I said, it also probably took a lot of time and energy to make it so. So I guess my question is, was it your intention to create a layout that was replicable for those of us crazy, filthy hackers who are just going to do things on our own? Was that a part of what inspired you to make the game look the way that it did? Or was it a byproduct of your minimalist, approach to life and to design that we talked about earlier? Probably a little column A, column B. Where did the design inspiration come from? And yeah, was it meant to inspire creativity?
Oh, yes. I think it is. It's a little bit of column A and column B, but it's, a game that you present to the world is your thesis on what you want to see in the gaming space. And that isn't just rules. It's how does it look? How can you use it? How does it run at the table? How does the book feel in your hands? Every element of it is a decision. And I think that when I was making those decisions, I wanted to convey to the people that liked Shadowdark what I thought was important, and actually what I would like to see too, So I am happy that people have taken that design method and applied it to their own work, because it's what I wanted to see more of. And when people are making stuff like that, I'm seeing more stuff that I'm like, yeah, this really aligns with what I hope for. And so, simplicity, I think, also gets out of the way of creativity. And, I think too that someone who wants to make material for Shadowdark is going to have, I hope, an easier time getting past the entry level things like, how do I lay this out? Because those decisions are pretty clear and simple. And if they align with what Shadowdark looks like, then all the better, in my opinion. I think that's wonderful. So yeah, hopefully it's an easy thing for people to leverage.
I can confirm for two knuckleheads you're talking to right now. So
yes.
Worked out. I want to keep with Shadowdark's design philosophy a little bit. We're going to drill down, specifically talking about classes. Now, you've made every class so far fit on 1 or 2 pages if they're a caster. And there's some underlying complexities, though, in these designs. You recently posted on Reddit some of your core tenets of class design. And again, it was this like in the subtlety and simplicity, there's also some unseen thinking and intentionality there. So with the acknowledgement that, like, yes, folks can do whatever they want to do and find the classes that best fit their style of play and their game and their table, can you identify something that when you see these classes that have been, just a proliferation, they're everywhere, which is, again, something you've said you really wanted to see with Shadowdark. It's a great first step in is design a class. is there anything you can point to of like, hey, I see this stumbling block often, and here's some advice for how to, not take an early misstep and not immediately step on the pressure plate that's going to send you down a dark and angry tunnel of design frustration. Where are the like, avoid this, maybe avoid this, and then go this other direction?
Yeah, this is so interesting to consider. That I think one of the things that I see in class design that immediately jumps out to me is I can tell if the person who made it is primarily a player and not a game master, because people who are players are in some way in direct opposition to the challenges that the game presents, which are meant to make players struggle. So players want to make their characters safer, to reduce risk, to make them more powerful, to give them more resources. And the game is meant to put barriers in the way of that. And so the game master has to have a lot of restraint in what they're giving to the players in order to keep the pursuit of those things worthy and worthwhile. And when somebody's a player and they make a class that they want to play, I see subtle things they put in there that are a little bit too much. Like the starting hit points are too high. The DCs for doing things are a little bit too low. And I think it's this and even giving too many features to a class instead of trying to rely on a few pillar features. There's a lot of scattered features that have a lot of complexity to them. And I'm not faulting people for like dabbling into design, but I think when you are making a class for Shadow Dark, one thing that really helps me is to think, am I going to be the only player at the table who's happy 100% of the time? Because if I am, I might have over-designed this class. I might be designing out inherent challenges that are supposed to limit me and make me struggle and make me feel pain and make me strive for more. So if your character is going to be happy and safe 100% of the time, it's not ready for the Shadow Dark yet.
There it is. Following with that idea of restriction, if you will, or limiting, can you talk specifically about the challenges of designing classes for Shadow Dark that share their kind of canonical lineage with D&D's kind of old school classes? I'm looking at the Ranger and the Bard that you did in a very public way, and a little bit of a teaser here, the forthcoming Druid. They share some lineage that's well established. And that's restraining in a way that I feel like we've got to watch you work through a little bit. Can you talk specifically about those kind of classes where they really share that deep lore lineage and mean so many things to so many people?
Yeah, those are so challenging. Oh, like the Bard is such a challenging class because, especially because it's had so many different presentations throughout time. And depending on when someone entered the game, they've sort of anchored their opinion of how this class should work probably on that style of Bard. So like the Bard the Bard has changed so much. And so part of the challenge there is trying to identify commonalities across the eras that are more of a flavor to the class and honoring that flavor while still converting it into like a Shadow Dark style mechanic, which is really, it can be really tough. And like, you have to leave a lot on the cutting room floor, like a lot. And, it's almost like you have to somehow find the three things that make this class iconic and discard all the rest of it. And as long as you can get away with those three things, I think you're about 80% of the way there to making most people happy with the presentation. But you can never make everybody happy, though, that's for sure. So
certainly not with the Bard.
No.
Certainly not with the Bard.
The Bard has changed a bit since the first iteration. That's for sure. But I also, what's funny is that the Bard's design at first moved a bit away from how I first designed it on the live stream, and then it actually moved back toward that version. Because I think it turns out that some of the core things we identified about how a Bard should feel in work remained true. And I had a lot of input from players who wanted to play the Bard, keeping it safe and happy 100% of the time. And I had to be the mean game master, game designer who's like, no, the Bard has to have flaws. Like the Bard has to not have everything that we want to give it.
So let's kind of stick with some of these assumptions that people bring to the game, whether it's, classes or otherwise. And, I think at times Jody and I have been surprised to find that some of our assumptions that we've brought to Shadowdark certainly didn't play out as expected. The game itself, depending on what system you're coming from, there's a lot of people coming from 5th edition, and there's obviously a lot of assumptions about how the game is going to work due to some of the mechanics in Shadowdark being very similar to 5th edition. But there's just a lot of assumptions that every single person, whether they be a game master or player, brings to a game. And I just thought it would be interesting, now the game has been out for a while and it's found a larger and larger audience. Are there any common misconceptions that you see about Shadowdark that you would like to, for once and for all, dispel here on this incredibly widespread and well listened to show?
Absolutely. I need to tell the world this information that
the world is listening.
Yeah.
Both of them.
Listen up, world. I got to tell you that the one that I find kind of the most, I almost want to say baffling, is that people say that you can't have like a long-term campaign in Shadowdark. Which
yeah.
It does crack me up because there's no domain play. And I'm like, well, about only 3% of players actually use domain play rules when they exist. So, just because it's there doesn't mean people use it or that it limits you from a long-term campaign. And so I think that there's been abundant evidence, not just from me saying so at this point, but people playing Shadowdark in long-term campaigns, showing that yes, you can have 50 session campaign, and Shadowdark was designed to actually wrap up as it was pitched. You're supposed to be able to reach 10th level, and when I calculated that out, that was based on having a weekly game for a year. So a character is supposed to have, if you're playing regularly, which is 4 times a month, and which adult that we know can actually play 4 times a month? I mean, come on. But the characters are supposed to reach a conclusion point at 10th level after about a year of gameplay. So that's 52 sessions, and so I think that you can cover a lot of ground in that time. And are there some people who want to do long-term campaigns that extend into the epic level tier? Yes, but Shadowdark as a game starts to break down at that level. So it's a game that's about a small heroic group doing things at the personal level. It's not about extra planner travel or building kingdoms or warfare or anything like that. So I think you can absolutely have a long-term campaign in Shadowdark, and then you can know when it's over too.
I mean, our 2.5-year Dolmenwood campaign would like to have a word with some of these folks who don't think that you can tell really amazing stories on a long-term basis. So totally agree, and have seen all of those things kind of come to fruition in our game. And we're 2.5 years in, and our highest level character is an 8th level wizard, and it's really, the arc of Shadowdark is not to be too over the top, but it's perfect for the kind of the length of campaign that is realistic in an era where we ain't got much time at the table, and we want to reach those high levels, and we want to see our players reach those high levels. So I feel that very deeply. And as somebody who, my first experience really with role-playing was cracking open a 5th edition player's handbook. Inevitably, you look at that thing and you go, look at all these cool levels I'm going to be able to play through. And then you play through the first 5 levels and your campaign is over. And to be able to offer the actual real prospect of reaching the highest level that the game was designed for is such an amazing opportunity for resolution and the feeling of closure in a campaign. So deeply felt, and thank you for making that a design principle.
Oh, thanks for playing it out like that. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, we're now getting to the question of, so what happens to this 8th level wizard who has from day one said that she is the most powerful wizard in the world and is on a trajectory to do just that. And now that we're starting to banter the question of but wait, where does she go in these last 2 levels? And she is no joke. And because we have mixed level parties, and comparatively now to my new character who just showed up at level 3, she does seem like the world's most powerful wizard. So holy cow, look at her.
Wow.
So sticking with GMing a little bit, What's one tip along this also idea of kind of like maybe dispelling myths or getting a little bit behind the scene with your perspective of, so you're going to run Shadow Dark. Maybe you do have experience running other games. And if you're a GM, what's one thing you would tell, hey, new person, you want to run a really feel Shadow Dark, do what it needs to do. Watch the engine sing. Do this as a GM and you'll have a better Shadow Dark session. What would be your kind of top tip for GMs to start out by latching onto?
That's really a great question. I think that you want to show the players kind of what the game's overall style is from the start. You want to give them a realistic look at it. And so I think I would encourage new game masters to put the players in sort of an open choice-based, somewhat large-ish kind of dungeon or exploration type setting, and have it try to be most focused on exploration and discovery. Like that's not to say you can't run an adventure that has like a plot where there's like scenes and you're trying to like reach a concluding moment or fight a boss monster or whatever. Like you can have that in Shadow Dark, but the game thrives on open-ended exploration. So I would say, Game Master, this is your first time running Shadow Dark, give your players first level characters and stick them in a dungeon and see which way they walk, and let them know, hey, you can go wherever you want, and let them get themselves into trouble and, let them make the decisions themselves, and their motivation need only be simple. You just need treasure. That's all you need. You're here for treasure. That's what drives you. Now do your best and just let them go.
The greed is good. Greed is good. So on that line of GMing and starting out, now you've obviously run more Shadow Dark than most folks, I'm going to assume. What are the differences between the awesome photos you share of you running open table convention games? I loved your statement I've heard you make a few times of just set up an open table, flop out a map and go. Love that. But you also have your home campaign that you are currently running, or have been running for quite some time. How do you approach those GMing tasks differently? I mean, the show is called Dungeon Master Diaries and what we do at the table and that sort of thing. So it feels only right we give you a chance to talk about your current GMing and maybe frame it around those two, or don't.
Yeah, what's so sad is I'm not running a home game right now, to my sadness, because one of my players moved to Denmark for a master's degree program, and so we put the game on pause, and then I also went into this crazy writing flurry for the Kickstarter that we have coming up. So I've been a little bit like off running regular games, but I do run games at conventions pretty frequently. However, for my home games, they're very, very free form, and because when I'm running a game at a convention, I'm usually running something that I've written, like a pre-written, more polished type dungeon. And I don't often run pre-written, like highly polished dungeons for my home group. Like if I know they're going to a dungeon, I'll kind of whip something up. But perhaps surprisingly to people, they spend a lot of time in the overworld, like not in the Shadow Dark itself, but a lot of time like running around above ground, like making alliances. My last time I ran for this group, they decided to enter an illicit drug trade and become the new barons of the drug trade. And they spent a lot of time above ground. And
I hear that happens to characters.
Yeah, does it? You might know.
My character.
Yeah, exactly. And I have to say that I never know what they're going to do from session to session. And so it's much less planned than even a convention game would be. And I like that because I love being surprised. My favorite thing is being surprised. And I actually get bored of, like, if I'm running the same adventure at a convention over and over, I get bored of it and I want to switch it up. So my home games are completely out of control. They just do whatever they want and I try to keep up with them. And I like that. So I think that anyone using Shadow Dark to run something utterly freeform, I mean, that's how I do it. So you can do it too.
There it is. Now, speaking of a structured adventure and convention gaming, one of, I think at the time of recording this, your most recent release on the Arcane Library YouTube channel is 2 free Shadow Dark adventures. And you introduce in that the Raiders of the Hidden Temple and explain that it has about 13 rooms and should be playable by a party in 2 to 3 hours. So a good convention game, perhaps. And Jody's jaw dropped when he heard this. Can you talk about pacing of a Shadow Dark game? Because that would take me longer, we'll say.
Yeah, Jody would like some personal
hell
personal advice. How do you run a session that efficiently?
Or make a guess at where am I getting lost in that I'm going 13 rooms. Yeah, that's like 8 hours of gameplay, and you're saying maybe 2, and I'm there's some misalignment here that I've done something.
It does come down to your players at the end of the day. Like if your players are the ones who want to go in every room and touch every wall panel, there's no way you're gonna get through that dungeon in 2 to 3 hours. It's more I push the pace of the games that I run pretty quickly. Like I call initiative pretty quickly, and Shadowdark doesn't have to run in super strict initiative order all the time, but especially at convention games, I tend to keep it that way, just to get the pace moving. And I like to incorporate a lot of foreshadowing to try to pull players out of the rooms that they're in. Like you hear a noise, or like you see the passageway, or like you catch the glint of gold coming from up the hall, something like that. I insert a lot of foreshadowing and pushing, and then call initiative super fast. So that particular adventure, that's about the limit of what you could fit into 3 hours. But you know, that I think in a convention setting, people have the mentality of like, we have to get through this in the given time. And almost like when you're reading something for you know, like let's say you're reading on a test, you're reading quickly. If you're reading for fun, you're going to read more slowly. And so when I run stuff for my home game, the natural pace is a little bit slower, and I'm not pushing the players as hard. So that's kind of the difference. But yeah, 2 to 3 hours. Lurking Fears is a company that I work with at conventions who runs official Shadowdark games. And they've run that one, and they're like, this one about pushes the limit for 3 hours. And I was like, yeah, I kind of figured, but...
Well, it's a goal now. I have set a goal to try and get through that much in that time frame.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of new Arcane Library content, let's talk about the Kickstarter. Next month, you are poised to release and kickstart 3 brand new Cursed Scrolls. The first 3 Cursed Scrolls each contained a setting, as well as classes, monsters, items, and other fun little goodies. And Cursed Scrolls maintain some semblance of continuity across them in terms of the world that they're set in. They are also distinctly their own thing. So first, what are you most excited about in terms of getting into people's hands with these new books? And also, why did you choose this particular method for expanding the content around Shadowdark and the core book? Why use these zines as the way to deliver new content to folks?
Yeah, well, I am super geeked about the zines in particular. The whole Kickstarter is going to be the 3 new zines, and then also like some unifying stuff, turning all 6 zines that exist into a setting called the Western Reaches. And I've been a little bit coy about talking about the Western Reaches. I haven't shown a lot of it yet, but there's going to be 2 books that come with the zines that put them all together. And I like presenting setting information in these sort of contained formats, partly because I think that like splat book creep is kind of a problem that is hopefully avoided by presenting self-contained resources like the Cursed Scrolls, because they are really mini settings each, and they're pinned to a geographical location, and there are classes and monsters and all of that are specific to that location. So if a game master like doesn't want to deal with having 50 class options or whatever, they can just say, hey, we're playing in this region. You can either use the core rules or the classes in this setting, but not like everything. So that was kind of my way of trying to make it easier for the GM to treat these things with modularity. I also just I like products that are sort of like self-contained. You know, like there's the sort of potpourri style zines that have like a mishmash of ideas and articles and styles and implementations. But I like having the zine just be all about the one topic. And so that's why I kind of put them forth in this way. So they're really easy to add in or really easy to take out. And it's kind of like the whole thing, either or.
So sticking with these, I'm gonna push you towards a little thing we got to get a little sneak glimpse on. The Basilisk Warrior class is coming out in the zine. Couldn't help but notice that one of your early YouTube videos for 5th edition adventure was the Temple of the Basilisk Cult. And there are some similarities undeniably between class and 5e adventure. Can you talk about that connection, if any, between those two?
Yes, there is. There's a total connection. It's the same Basilisk cultist, because everything I've written both for 5th edition and Shadow Dark is continuous in my own like personal game world that I've never really set to paper, but it's just been something that I've expanded over time. So yeah, the 5th edition Basilisk Cult adventure is the exact same cult that is being presented in Curse Scroll 4 plus the playable class. So that's cool that you noticed that, because I think sometimes people are surprised to hear that everything I've published for 5th edition is indeed also part of my Shadow Dark world. And there are entire adventures I've written that I mention briefly in a Shadow Dark zine. For example, in the first Curse Scroll zine, there's a town called Wardenwood, and it's, spoiler alert, there's like werewolves and witches and stuff. And I've actually written a 5th edition adventure called The Curse of Wardenwood. And it's about that town and that situation. So I just can't help but connect things. I always do. I don't think I've written anything in total isolation at all. Ultimately comes back to sort of the game world that I've been running since I started game mastering.
Bringing us back to the Kickstarter, we were a little surprised to see that the Druid was not an entirely new class, but instead an expanded series of spells that are specifically given to wizards who are neutrally aligned. Can you talk a little bit about taking this approach to the Druid versus some of the other Druid classes that have been created that involve any number of various kind of shape-changing features or other things that might be more closely aligned to 5th edition or some of the other Druid class analogs out there?
Yeah, this was such an interesting conundrum for me designing the Druid, because at first I did try to make it its own class, like its own sort of spellcaster. And I kept running into two things, which is, to me, one of the most iconic Druids is, strangely enough, Merlin. You know, the classic wizard who I always have felt that he's more of a Druidic type wizard, but yet a wizard, you know, and someone who was not living out in the forest and, you know, hugging trees all day. He was in King Arthur's court, you know, using his extreme intelligence to advise the king. And so it started to occur to me that I was trying to design a Druid, and I was shoehorning in Druid things it could do, like turn into animals, simply because I was trying to differentiate it from the wizard, not because I actually felt it was needed. And then I was like, you know what, I'm going to try something different. The wizard is such a flexible class, and basically every spell it gets is a new talent in a way. And so I was like, I'm gonna make a list of spells that reflect a lot of these things that Druids can do in other game systems, but in the form of a spell. And stuff that they can reach via progression, which is a great thing that spellcasters have. They can achieve new talents once the time is right and they've reached that threshold of power. So when I implemented the spell list for them instead, I was like, it's just so much more direct and simple, and it's in alignment with how I view a wizard like Merlin, who is intelligent, engages with society, but is in tune with the natural, and might direct his spellcasting more towards the natural order than conventional spellcasters. So that's ultimately why I went with that.
I think you could make a pretty strong argument about another famous wizard named Gandalf, who throws sparking pine cones and talks to moths. And
yep, the Tolkien wizards also played into my decisions, because, spoiler alert, there's going to be a lawful spellcaster spell list in one of the zines and a chaotic wizard spell list in one of the zines as well, where wizards can choose to specialize into those angles, and they each have a different flavor to them that leans into something. Like the chaotic wizards they're more inclined towards power at any cost, and the lawful wizards are more inclined towards protecting and abjuration and breaking curses, and even a little bit of crossover into the priest space, where they can do things like expunge poisons and stuff. So there's all these different flavors that wizards can go based on their spells, and I was like, I don't think I need to reinvent the wheel. I think I just need to dial in the spellcasting, and then we're going to get very, very different styles of wizards.
Fantastic. I know there's a few of our players who will go, chaos wizards, you say? I'm here for this.
Yes.
And we'll be that it will be just the right flavor of catnip to send them off a dark path. I want to talk a little bit about the Druid a touch more. And we talked earlier about class designs and honoring things, and then rules as written, and this kind of comes all together. We got to enjoy playing a little bit of the Druid. I did a little micro sprint of a 2-dayer session to see what the Druid looked like. And one of the things that really stood out to us was the tree shape spell for the Druid that allows the Druid to turn into a treant, which means they get 2 attacks around, and formidable attacks at that. There was a really epic one-on-one fight between a treant and an ogre while hags were running around and doing other nonsense for the rest of the party. Was very, very cool. But that's also breaking kind of one of your core rules that gives 2 attacks in a round. Why here?
Yes, you're so right. This is so funny because Michael was also talking to me about this too, and he was like, wait, you're giving them 2 attacks? And there's 2 reasons behind it. The first one is, as silly as this sounds, I want to show people that if you do it in a controlled way, you can break the rules a little bit. And the second thing is that the ability of the treant to attack twice and the tier of the spell lands around the same spot that wizards would be starting to choose, like fireball and stuff like that. And so it actually came down to like a math equation where I was like, well, we can either give we can encourage a druid to take this spell over fireball by making it closely equivalent to the damage, but then not an all-in attack, which would have been absurd. Like even a normal treant wouldn't have an attack that can deal fireball level damage. So then we split it into 2 attacks to make it a little bit more palatable. And because it's gated behind a spell casting check, and it's a spell that can go away on failure, it's not like an always on thing. And so for those reasons, I was okay with it. And I'm sure not everybody's going to like it, and some people might house rule it, but I feel like there's enough limitation on it, and it needed the encouragement to be chosen over fireball. If I recall, it's a tier 3 spell, but it might be different. I might have changed that. So it kind of had to be taken in context of the other spells, and the challenge behind successfully casting it repeatedly is pretty high. So it's like a limited thing. So I was okay with it.
Once again, when we're talking about wizards, everything comes back to fireball.
Yes, it does.
Want to give you an opportunity, though. We've asked you some questions that we're interested in, but you inevitably have things that you're super excited for people to know about, and wanted to give you an opportunity to just tell folks what you're excited about and what you want them to know about the upcoming Curse Scroll Kickstarter. What can people expect? What do you have in store?
Yeah, I'm super excited for some of the approaches I've taken in the new zines. Like one is a complete city setting, and it's probably the most differently presented and laid out of the zines, so I'm excited for that. But what I'm really excited about is finally getting to like peel back the curtain on a little bit of world lore about how these 6 zines interrelate, but also with the promise that I'm going to be very careful, as I always am, not to shoehorn things not to foist things onto the game master that they might not want to use. So the material that's combining these 6 zines is very much in the vein of I don't want to just say suggestions, but it's like it's vague enough that you can still make it your own. But it's trying to give people legitimate world setting information that the core rules of Shadowdark is very, very, very light on. So, I'm excited to see how people react to that and see how they make use of it. And I hope that people find it useful and find the presentation a little bit. It might not be what they're expecting, but I think it's what they might need. So that's what I'm hoping it will be.
So we are in the process of kind of redesigning a quasi West Marches style game. So would something like what this Kickstarter is offering be potentially useful to folks who are running open tables? Is it going to have a map that folks can look at and explore? What do you got for the folks who are running open tables? Because there's a lot of people who have really gravitated toward Shadowdark because it's great for that.
Yeah, I love open tables. It's one of my favorite ways, and this Kickstarter is in support of that style of play, which the name The Western Reaches is an absolute nod to West March's style of play, because that's what it's trying to facilitate. It's giving further setting information so that we have our 6 curse scroll zines. I feel like we have a huge amount of different places that the characters could go. And then it's trying to give the connective tissue so that you can easily make them all work in unison with each other. And like, you don't have to make a game world map for yourself that unites them all. I'm gonna show the one I have that unites them all. And so there is gonna be a regional map that allows you to move between all the different parts of the Western reaches and use it hopefully for a very robust open table experience.
Fantastic. We'll put a pause on the re-rack. Matt has a really big barrel maze to get some people through too, so
nice.
We'll be good for a little bit.
You got some time.
Kelsey, we cannot thank you enough for coming on, chatting with us, sharing some goodies about what's coming and the work in your past. More than anything, thank you for being welcoming, much like those folks in your early days, and continuing to make a place for all of us to gather at the table. Thank you so much for joining us around the fire and on the show. Would love to have a chance to talk to you again in the future if the stars align. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. This was so much fun.
All right, Jody. So another huge, enormous thank you to Kelsey for spending so much of her time that she could have been spent focusing on editing or writing, and she spent it with us two knuckleheads.
Doing literally anything else. Filing taxes.
Yeah. But we wanted to have just a brief discussion here about some of our takeaways. So, Jody, give me one of your kind of top-line takeaways, your thoughts from this interview, other than it being awesome.
Oh, wait. Now I got to think, because that was going to be my first one. Honestly, a quote I go back to all of the time, over and over and over. It is a behind-the-scenes video interview with the Lord of the Rings cast, and Christopher Lee is speaking of Ian McKellen, and he says, he's just such a nice man. And then he pauses and goes, what a terrible thing to say about somebody, but I mean it in the most genuine way. What a lovely and kind and welcoming person Kelsey is. Like, as she appears to be on the internet and in her videos and in every interview I've seen in preparing to chat with her today, just such a welcoming person and so excited and enthusiastic about the hobby. And it's so nice to see a content creator, both with a clear physical view of what they're creating, but also just with a presence in social media, who is positive and joyous about things and is imminently welcoming and excited about the creative process and gaming and being at the table. And so, like, I'm just geeked up right now of like, yeah, I want to play and I want to be excited and I want to make a map and I'm going to draw some dragons and I'm going to go home. So that is my first one, is just that welcoming and kind-hearted nature just coming across so clearly and so earnestly is refreshing. It's easier to get bogged down in the negativities of the internet.
Well, that was actually going to be my kind of top line takeaway is positivity. And I don't think we've ever said it out loud on the show, but like, one of the things that we really strive for is to keep the tone of this show positive, because there is so much negativity in gaming. People frustrated about rules, people frustrated about their players or whatever it is. And it's true of not just in role-playing games, it's true of the whole gaming hobby in general. There's just a lot of negativity that can come out in discussions, especially on the internet. And I think what strikes me is a genuine positivity and a desire to, like you said, be welcoming, but just an excitement about playing, an excitement about being at the table, sharing some time, having adventures, being just something that all of us enjoy doing. And it really comes through in Kelsey's work and in the way that she talks about Shadowdark and talks about role-playing games, that she's just a positive force and would just be such a joyous person to roll dice with. And I am glad that we have planted our flag firmly in the camp of Shadowdark, because that positivity runs through the community, I think, in a lot of ways, and it starts at the game's creator.
You know, it's funny, we talked about the art a little while back and about how the art has a particular style and look, and the cover of the book is a death metal artist, is the actual artist. That's their forte and their specialty. And I was recently scrolling the internet and I saw something that was just lovely as a positive that is an analog here of yeah, Shadow Dark can be lethal. You can lose characters here and there. It's a thing that can happen. You know, the art is pretty heavy. The mood itself can be pretty heavy. Before we recorded today, you talked a little bit about needing a funny scene and brought in a funny NPC. And this little social media blurb I saw was about that a little girl was lost in a grocery store, and she walked up to the person who was making the post, is very punk rock as an adult and lots of chains and heavy makeup and spikes. And she walked up to the punk rock woman and said, "Hey, I can't find my mom." And she got it squared away and got the kid back to her mom. And then the punk rock woman kind of looked over at the mom, was like watching the kid with her mom. And some interaction was had of, "Mom, you were right. When I'm in trouble, go ask a police officer or a punk rocker and they'll help me out." And that, like, sometimes that very dark exterior is about a contrast of, like, also really embracing the joy, that, like, light and dark thing. And I know that was very rambly and, like, nonsensical, but I genuinely feel like there is something to that joy is beautifully paralleled by that darkness. And those two things somehow keep either one from taking the other two seriously. Right. That whimsy you talked a little bit about in her adventure design, and like that works so well, and it falls flat in other areas, in other settings, in other games, because there's not the counterbalance. So that juxtaposition, especially of her as a designer, old school versus new school, right? Like modern design, old school vibes. Like it's that bridging of gaps that I think allows there to be, you know, something for everybody or not, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think I will kind of just say in closing that for me, and the reason that I think you and I both gravitated toward Shadow Dark in the first place was the simplicity of the design and the clarity of the design, and that can get you in the door. But what has kept us around is a sense that the game provides you the opportunity. It opens doors to tell the stories that you want to tell. And it was very clear in talking to Kelsey that this game was born out of wanting to tell stories at the table, and that the conversation that we had about her kind of arc as a player and a designer really, to me, spoke to the underlying grounding elements of Shadow Dark that make it enduring for us, in the sense that it is both based off of a rock solid foundation in terms of experience at the table, right? Like there is a level of familiarity and understanding of what role-playing games are and what rule sets can and cannot do, etc. But then there was an intentionality to create a game that could do that for other people who maybe don't have that experience, who are coming to role-playing games, who are new, or who are coming to role-playing games from other more complicated systems and are looking for something. They know that there's something out there that they can tell stories with, and they can that will just get out of the way and let people have fun. And I feel like that's the thing that keeps us coming back is that intentionality to create a system that, you know, no system is perfect. No system can do everything that you want it to do, but a system that gets pretty damn close.
It's beautifully said, my friend. All right, as the torchlight grows dim, we hope you were able to find something useful in our discussion today that you can take into a future game. If you can't, that's on you. If you have any questions or unique experience for your table that you'd like us to discuss in a future episode, head on over to the Dungeon Mastery Diaries thread in the Shadow Dark Discord channel. Feel like folks are going to have something to say about this one. Look for links to any material we referenced in this episode. There were a bunch, and they're going to be in the show notes too. If you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can find Jody on the Shadow Dark Facebook page under the handle Pezman, and you can message Matt via Discord using the handle SCMatt. Until next time, good luck, friends.
Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network. It is produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster. Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production and is not affiliated with the Arcane Library, LLC. Shadow Dark RPG is a product of the Arcane Library. Copyright 2023.
Matt, pause 1 second.
Yeah, what do you got?
I have an honest to God, Jody, self-serving question I want to ask you.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna
Do
leave
you want me
the-
to pause my recording as well?
You can or not. I don't care.
No, I'll leave it.
So
I'll
Matt,
leave it.
this is Jody is like, Matt's so sick of hearing this crap. So I'm like, I'm just going to ask Kelsey because I get a chance to ask her.
Oh,
I'm gonna. The gold economy in Shadow Dark. Where is it from?
No.
Like the like, how much does it cost to live versus buy an item versus how much you get from a run? There's a world economy there, and like, I'm like, is it 5e? Is it old school? It's not old school because there's bajillions of gold coins running around in old school.
Right. Which annoyed me because it was impractical. I was like, you can't be dumping 5,000 gold pieces into this town's economy every time you come back from a dungeon. But even more so, it was impractical for character. It didn't make sense to me. And I always found totaling things in the thousands to be like so aggravating. But it's so, the entire gold system, the value of gold is based actually through back reverse engineering from the set value of a diamond. And I tried to make a diamond worth, and I'm trying to remember now, because I did this like many years ago now. I took the value of a diamond and I made that equal to the value of like a year's worth of hard labor or something, or expert level labor. I might have been basing this off of like the cost of engagement rings or something at the time. But I tried to make the diamond sort of the thing that was like the most valuable piece of currency, and then run it backwards to try to make an internally coherent economy that referenced back to that. So it doesn't make sense like it doesn't make sense outside of itself, but contextually within itself, it all kind of points back to the total cost of a diamond. And also trying to balance it to keeping the amount of treasure that one could carry or should carry to like a reasonable amount. So I had to make crazy spreadsheets that like did all these calculations where I'd be like, insert value of diamond, and then it was like extrapolate that across all this other stuff, and then like dial it in until I got the right balance between how much stuff somebody can and should carry versus how much value does a diamond have, and does that give us enough wiggle room to make things have nuance to their value. Someday I'll find that spreadsheet. But yeah.
Brad, no, thanks. Because the core math is, if you're an adventure for profit, it has to be worthwhile. Mm-hmm. So you have to make as much as like you said, like an expert labor or something. Otherwise, the entire fiction of being an adventurer falls apart.
Yeah.
And if it's so valuable, then why wouldn't freaking everybody do it? You know, and anyway, so thank you for indulging me.
I am so annoyed that there was such a amazing answer to that question, because I have been, Jody has asked me this. He's like, there must be a reason. There must be a reason. And of course you've done a ton of work on this, but now I feel very sheepish.
Oh no!
Because I have.
Well, I didn't just choose the numbers, but it wasn't like I was doing calculus. I was just making sure things looked reasonable, you know. So that was all.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for lending us so much of your time, Kelsey. This was awesome.
Thank you. It was so good to talk to you both. Thanks for asking these great questions and letting me ramble on about it. I appreciate it so much.